every culture globally will name something new when it comes into their world. They never ask permission, they just do it.
Mhm.
So I think culturally, a lot of people have forgotten that they have the agency, they have the power to name the world around them.
Like the words are never the end all. They're portals to greater openings around thoughts
Mm.
and possibilities and new perspectives.
Welcome to Dialogues, Language and Ecology. This series of conversations is part of the experiences and dialogues around our Volume 9 under the theme of language. We want to place our edition in conversation with other researchers and artists who are also exploring the intersections between language and ecology. Throughout the 5 interviews of this series, we spoke to guests about their work, research, and projects, which, like ours, are concerned with how language shapes our relationship with ourselves and with the more than human world. With each of these encounters, we seek to expand our perception and understanding of language, and to find and create languages that nurture more attentive and careful ways to relate to the landscapes we inhabit. Heidi Quante and Alicia Escott are two interdisciplinary artists, founders of the Bureau of Linguistical Reality, a public participatory artwork focused on creating new language as a way to better understand our rapidly changing world due to man-made climate change and other anthropogenic events. Their project was inspired by moments in which both Heidi and Alicia felt literally at a loss for words to describe emotions, ideas, or situations they found themselves experiencing because of climate change. Through public participation and pop-up installations, they ask people to help them come up with new words, which they later use to facilitate conversations about the experiences these words are seeking to express. Their aim is to enable a greater cultural shift around climate change. We spoke with Heidi and Alicia about the fundamental role language plays in how we experience and make sense of the world, and also about the ability to create new possibilities, relationships, and different ways of being through language.
So, Heidi, Alicia, thank you so much for being here and for taking the time to speak with us in the frame of our ninth edition on language. We're so excited to speak to you. As you know, one of the themes that we're exploring in our ninth edition is precisely this fundamental role that language plays in how we experience and make sense of the world. So I thought, I'm curious, and we can start there to know what role language has had in your own lives. How has it shaped your perception of the world, and also how has it influenced your work today through the Bureau of Linguistic Reality?
So I grew up speaking 3 languages,
Mm.
and also I was also found myself, but I'm first generation, so I live in the United States, and found myself always frustrated that English couldn't always express the languages that I grew up speaking other languages before English. And then I noticed that at a young age. And the other thing I noticed at a young age too was my mother never told me I created my own language. Which children do. If you've ever been
Mm.
around children, they'll start saying and creating names. And my mother never told me that's not a word. And in fact, she created a little dictionary called Heidi's
Mm.
Dictionary. So the family would speak it, but my own little language died because once I left the family, there's no one else
Mm.
speaking it. But what I realized at a young age was the limits of words, but
Mm.
also the power of words. Because if I couldn't share something that was important to me because it was lacking in the English language, I couldn't be my full self. So I think I've always been fascinated by the power of limit or the power of language to communicate, but also the limits if you're
Mm.
confined to a language that doesn't have the words to express or share your worldview.
Mm.
Yeah, and I would follow up on that. I differently. grew up only speaking English, and I had always felt a sort of poverty around that.
Mm.
And I had never really felt like English was the architecture that best expressed my thoughts.
Mhm.
And, living inside of that, I'd always had this sort of like, what would it be like to be able to speak other languages? And I think in many ways, that is how I became a visual artist. Even though
Mm.
as a visual artist, I use language and writing significantly. I think that it was sort of a way to get outside of that. And in many ways, I think the Bureau, for me, it's not about the words themselves. And in a certain way, there's kind of a trickery to it. It's about creating a space, whether that's psychological or physical, like bringing people together to recognize, by inviting people to create new words, we're giving them the opportunity to think for a minute or sit in a space for a minute outside of words and outside of language and kind of feel out the boundaries of that. And I think that's one of the powerful things about the Bureau.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, I think like what you're speaking about, it's also very present in our edition about the impossibility of language, and more so a single language to contain everything, right? And like this very important need to stretch the possibilities of language. Because with every new language, like there comes like a whole cosmology behind it, right?
Yeah.
So I guess this is kind of what you're pointing towards with your own experiences. And I guess this is sort of what also what you're trying to do with the Bureau, right?
Yeah. And I think also when you look at the history of language in any culture, what we're seeking to do is use humor
Mm,
and to show like there is no bureau. Every
mm,
culture globally will name something new when it comes into their world. They never ask permission, they just do it.
mhm.
So I think culturally, a lot of people have forgotten that they have the agency, they have the power to name the world around them. And if the words don't exist, they also historically have
Yeah.
the right to create that word. And if
Mhm.
it's delicious enough, it will become a part of any lexicon. And so I think the beauty of this one medium, because there's so many ways that people can express themselves, is that it's free. Anybody can do it. And because human beings were like a pack species, once it's adopted by enough
Mhm.
people, it becomes a way to shift culture that I
Mhm.
think we've forgotten. A lot of people have the agency. Like some people will come to our experiences and say, for example, on the issue of climate change, oh, I'm not a politician. Oh, I'm not a scientist. Oh, I don't like to protest in the street. But you can be a culture shifter by creating new words to give voice to the world or the values that are important to you. And I think for some people who go through the Bureau, it's just one other way of having agency over their culture or as a part of their culture that I think has been forgotten.
Mm.
Now, I'll follow up on that and saying it's not just in the word making. You see us in our little uniforms. We've got the badges behind us. The badge and the sort of faux bureaucracy that
Mhm.
we embody as an artwork, clearly we're not an actual office. Um, but we take on that role as a way to like, when we give those badges, we're giving folks that agency officially that they've always had,
Mhm.
so it's
Mhm.
sort of a holistic approach into like using humor um and art to get people talking about these things.
Completely. And I love the word that you're using, this agency. I think that's so important. And it was so important for us as well, because another key thread in this edition is this idea that language is not just describing the world, it's making sense of the world, and it actively creates it, right? It's language creates possibility, it creates relationships, it creates new ways of being. And I think that is one of the things that we find so compelling about your work. You're inventing new words, but you're also imagining and shaping new worlds. So I'm just curious, how do you see that relationship between words and world or world making, and how does this interplay come up in your work with the Bureau?
I think it's also we have to respect, many, many cultures. Like one of the questions you asked is what are the new words that give more respect and
Mm,
agency to all sentient beings? I mean, the heartbreaking thing is that when you look at many other languages globally, I think we have 700 languages right now that are still alive in the world. 700. That's a lot of, unless I got the number wrong, but I believe when I last looked it up, it was 700. So many languages have words that respect other living beings.
mhm,
It does not create a hierarchy of the humans on top. So we also want to acknowledge that English, when you look at the human history of humans on this earth, like it's a very short time that English has had
mm,
such dominance globally. So we also want to acknowledge there's a wealth of words. They just need to be uplifted and shared and used that many other cultures have cultivated globally. And also in the English language, you can revive words. Like we have the word the commons. And when you look at the genesis of the word the commons and the etymology, it means like a shared land or space.
mm,
And so this did exist, but it now has lost its value. So I think it's also not just creating new words, it's uplifting existing words,
mhm,
and it's also bringing power back to words that you find in English, but due to industrialization and different power
Colonialism.
dynamics have lost their place, but we can
mhm,
bring them back up. I don't know if I answered your question.
And and I'll sort of follow up on that also, like this idea of word making, I'm
mm,
sorry, world making out of this, sticking with English, we've got all these terms, Armageddon, apocalypse, end of world, doomsday. And yet we don't have a common word to talk about a positive, progressive, sustainable future that
mhm,
is attainable. And this is something we talk a lot about with the Bureau. We've got this term, utopia, which literally means no place. And it's always sort of tethered to this idea of dystopia, like that its failure is innate with that. So like if we can't even imagine
mm,
a sustainable world in front of us, like how are we, how are we gonna have that?
mhm,
There's the word abracadabra, that's like an ancient word that originally meant as I speak it, so it becomes.
mm,
These moments where like just by whether it's a word or just bringing into the collective imagination and vis-a-vis through the individual. We start with just people on people. We're really focused on conversations and creating spaces to talk more than just like proliferating the words
mhm,
out there.
mhm,
But like through those individual conversations, thinking about a collective sense of thinking about a world that we want,
mhm.
And so it's about creating those spaces. And then the words themselves, they become these points of connectivity.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I love it because I think what I see a lot in your work is that it's, as you were saying, Alicia, earlier, like this space of reflection on how words sort of conquer our imagination, of what is possible. And if we are confined by just like a limited set number of like words or just one language, or but by, as you say, Heidi, like just words that are trendy now and not remembering like the words that used to give meaning to our lives, then our imagination also gets kind of constrained, right?
Mm.
And in a way, in your workshops, I think what you're doing is creating this space for imagination to be more than that. Alicia, you said it earlier, that to step out of language and see, um, what our imagination can do. And so I think that's like a good follow question, like this relationship between imagination and the possibility to create new words, and how are you trying to create that space?
I think what's fascinating is we had well, the first year, so we've been in existence for over 10 years.
Mm,
And the first year, we used to have salons where we would bring together 6 to 8 people who never met each other but came from different disciplines. And we had it in my house for dinner. So people would come, literally, they'd come at 6 p.m. and sometimes not leave till 1 a.m. And they were strangers, but we would say, okay, here's a theme, and we want you to bring a feeling or experience for which you wish there was a word for this theme.
mm,
And one of the themes we did is what does it mean to be maternal in the Anthropocene? So when you look at the English language, a lot of women, if you choose not to have children, you oftentimes do it because of tremendous love for all living beings and tremendous caring for all, and it's a conscious love choice. But the English language is so anemic, it doesn't represent this tremendous love. They'll say things like, oh, you're childless. Oh, I feel so bad for you. And so in this beautiful salon, we had a mother of 3, we had men, we had women who chose not to have children. And one of the words that came up was kinkara. And it's a beautiful way to say there are people, both male and female, who have maternal roles that help raise a lot of children in every culture. They may not have biological children, but they are very important maternal figures.
mm,
And so that's just an example of a salon where many people feel that there's a new words are needed to express what does it mean to be maternal in the
mhm,
Anthropocene. And when you don't have children, it shouldn't just be negative words that are used to express your choice, but also really intentional and purposeful words. And so Kinkara has such a beautiful, it also comes from caring. It's inherently a word of deep, deep caring. And the nice thing about language and how it proliferates is that if I'm at a dinner and I'm having food with other people, and someone says, oh, why did you choose not to have children? Which right there just sounds so negative. You could say, oh, I'm a Kinkara. And people will automatically assume that they
mm,
don't know what this word means because you say it with confidence and you've self-defined what you are. And then
mhm,
it allows this opportunity for you to define what is a Kinkara. So you're it's like almost like a way to change a worldview or change a conversation by simply inserting a word that represents an entire cosmology, if that
mhm,
makes sense.
mhm. It does definitely.
Like a key. It's like
Yeah.
words can be keys,
Mhm,
open whole new portals and worlds.
yeah.
And a lot of our words are bad. Like they're not, they don't flow great. And we're okay with that. And
Mhm,
sometimes the bad words actually seem more academic. So people
mm,
think they're fancy when, actually we're using humor quite often.
mhm,
And, we have a lot of experiences where because they're not the perfect world, and it's not all dialed in and packaged. That's another point of engagement where people can be like, oh, yeah, well, here's another word for that. So again, it's not like the words are never the end all. They're portals to greater openings around thoughts
mm,
and possibilities and new perspectives.
mhm. I love that. Yeah, I think that it's also one of our explorations that words as containers, language as containers, but not necessarily obviously they're not experienced themselves, like they can only give us like a temporary container so that we can open up into an experience. And as we believe, through our work with this edition, is that one of maybe the problems that we have in our society is that we confuse language with reality,
Mm.
that we don't make like this distance, this little gap that there is, between the actual experience and language. And I think your project is brilliant in the sense that it's coming already from a recognition of limitation, that
Yeah.
that's the starting point. Language is limited. It cannot contain everything, but it gives us a portal into experience. And I think that's also very interesting. Yeah.
But I think it's also important to note that language does have tremendous power too, because whenever anybody invades another country or attempts
Oh,
to colonize
yes.
another country, the first thing they do
Mm.
is make the native language illegal.
Mhm.
It happens globally. So I think it's both an and, right? Like if the word no longer represents a cultural value, it's just a shell.
Mhm.
But it also has tremendous power in you can migrate to another country, you can travel to another country. And if you keep your language alive, you also keep some of your values alive.
Mhm.
But the challenge too is that words will no longer have meaning if you're not able to practice what that means.
Mm.
So I think it's one, it can be so many things, but I think we forget to examine the power of language.
Mhm.
Um, and so with the Bureau, we seek to have these conversations. And also, we don't follow linguistical rules. We follow more, what is the world we want to live in? So we will
Mhm.
take many different languages and put them together in one word,
Mm.
like Chukaho Soul or a friend who wrote a new Chinese character, to reveal that we also have the power to shape culture in a new direction
Mhm.
that we may have not yet imagined before, because now, as our world is ever connected, and we don't have to travel very far distances to be in another culture, we also can then perhaps create new words and new languages that reflect our inner connectedness by taking different languages and putting them together,
Mm.
which, if you're a strict linguist, wasn't always culturally acceptable.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I just want to follow up on that. When we're bringing these words together, we're always respecting people's backgrounds. We're working with people who are, speakers of those languages. We're not just picking them willy-nilly. We're always meeting our
Mm.
participants where they are with their backgrounds and
Mhm.
honoring, that. And I love, Alessandra, what you were saying about the words as vessels,
Mm.
and containers. And I think that that's like a really, because we're investigating language at large, which is like the worldview, it's the structure, it's the grammar, it's the way we, think about things, but also like the words themselves. And, Heidi was saying, we started this project 10 years ago. And, now I think, we've got Gen Alpha and Gen Z and like the words that are being created and the language that's being created and, the movement of emojis. Like there's, messaging and all of these things has changed language really rapidly. And of course, the overlap of languages, but, Heidi was using the term Anthropocene, which we're very, very, very critical of. There's so many terms that term has spawned that are in
Mhm.
critique of it, and we're absolutely in support of that. And we've talked about that at length. But, when this project, when we were thinking about these projects, like in the years before Heidi and I got together, I was thinking about these terms like when Anthropocene started to come into parlance, and then the term by Glenn Albright, solastalgia. And these were terms that really shifted the way people thought about their world. And I thought of them as like little artworks in and of themselves. And with solastalgia, I started noticing so many artists using that term as this sort of catch-all vessel for all of these feelings and experiences around environmental melancholy at large. And I was like, oh, somebody needs to create a lexicon for this. And then when Heidi and I came together, Heidi was like, we should do that. And we should make it this like social, engagement that's not just about us, but sort of uplifts folks. And I think that idea of the container and recognizing that the containers don't always fit, and also recognizing that when we think of the shape of a container, we think of that in like a porcelain solid thing, but these are very fluid bodies. A word can shift meaning over time. We can be using the same word and have um, different interpretations of that. And so that thinking around language, I think, is really, really fun for us.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think it's very resonant with our project as well, in the sense of understanding language as a living being. It's an organism in itself. It goes through cycles, it grows, it can die as well. It can come back, it can regenerate. So um, we spoke a lot about sort of softening the edges, of language, about just recognizing how changeable, how mutable it can be. And as you were very well pointing towards, is the agency that we have in that relationship, that
Mhm.
it's not that we own or have a language, it's that we are participating in a relationship with this, being that has its own sort of power or energy. I don't know. Yeah. I don't know how you see it, like language as a living being.
And I think it's also important, like what we teach our children. I would love to
Mm,
see a world where, what if all children, when they would create a new word, were told, "Oh, that's beautiful, tell me more."
mm,
Because then a child is coming into the world believing they have agency
mhm,
over naming their world. And then
mhm,
I'm sure you have too many words and they're not all used, and then they become compost for something else. But
mhm,
if all children were encouraged to name things in the way they want to, I think psychologically you'd have a different psychological view of what kind of
mhm,
role you have growing up in culture.
mhm.
I think you would see yourself more as able to impact it if you were told, "Oh, yes, tell me your new word."
Yeah. And I
Yes.
think it would expand what a word constitutes, like
Mm.
maybe there's a sound coming from other
Mhm.
beings that could also be a word, because meaning is everywhere, meaning is given in a way. So, and it sort of brings me also to another thing that I wanted to bring to this conversation, and is how all of this has to do with our relationship with the more than human world.
Mhm.
What words again enable in our imagination as a who has agency, who can speak, who can we relate to, who can we have a conversation with. I think words have a powerful weight there as well.
Yeah. And then like going back, there's 700 languages, and many other, like if you look at Maori from New Zealand, body parts are the same as the land. Um, in the river dialect I grew up with, we have spökikika, and spökikika are people who can see spirits. But if
Mm,
I try to have, when I was a child, my mother said, "Don't say that," because she wanted me to do well in the United
mhm,
States. Like, don't, they won't understand, but it's lost in translation because
mm,
culturally that's not a valuable thing by the dominant culture in the United States. But then when I talked to my friend Shelley, who's Nisenan, who also is a river culture, she was like, "Oh, yes." So I
mm,
realize it's like you can create a word to name powers or a relationship to other
mm,
animals. But oftentimes the elders or other people are like, "Don't say that in
mhm,
English to people who don't respect that relationship because they won't, no matter how many times you say the word or define the word, they won't understand the word." Does that make
mm,
sense? Like the word could exist for
mhm,
a greater empowerment for other animals, but if you're saying it in a culture that doesn't value that relationship, the word can't always have the same meaning as the culture that created that word.
mhm, mhm.
I don't know if that makes sense, Alessandra, or
For sure, yeah.
yeah.
And I think that like a lot of it, and when we're talking about words and language, it's attention, right? It's like where we
Mhm,
place attention. And they've done a lot of studies that like when we lose linguistic diversity, we literally lose biological diversity. You
mhm,
know, when we lose the ability to name the things in our
mhm,
world, they become less real to us. Um, I know I'm using a lot of they and us's, when of course these are unique individual cultures and beings. And I mean, that's something really interesting. I work a lot with plants and seeds and growing things, and I actually really love to not know the names of things as long as possible, especially I grow a lot of wildflower seeds that are native to here in California. And like I love to see them grow and their life cycle, and that becomes a way of knowing them.
mhm,
And then later on, learn the names, because that kind of can sometimes close things in. You know, once you know the name for something, then you think you know it when there's another way of knowing in those other. And I just want to go back, you know, you were saying about words outside of language or outside of like, you know, linguistic norms, which Heidi pointed to a lot of that we've done with mixing different languages. But this makes me think of this word refuvescence that we have as part of the Bureau, that is sort of this moment of transition when compost goes from being waste to being fertile new growth. And it really speaks also to the magic of bacteria and fungi as these co-creators, and thinking of them as and then also thinking of the people who do that work in a society. So we're often taking something that might be in the natural world, quote unquote, or an individual experience, and relating it to things that are happening on societal levels. So thinking about like compost of empire and that shift. And so for that word, we also have the term whirring, which is meant to think about the rim of a glass and the transition of sound as this moment of transformation within rotting cultures and societies. And then that I found myself using the when the worm emoji came on, that and this like sparkle. And so the slang that we also had for that term was worm dazzle. And I found myself using this combination of emojis, and I was like, oh my gosh, I'm actually, you know, utilizing worm dazzle as an emoji. So it sort of like naturally turned into all these things. So again, that's like one feeling or experience, but lots of, you know, potential words for it.
And if I can add, Alessandra, to that, I got a science degree, and I was very frustrated that, when you grow up learning plants names, I was very frustrated because also in California, there's a lot of native people who are still alive here who know the native word for the plant, and the native word for the plant embodies all the properties. So for example, when I was a child growing up here in Northern California, there was a plant called soap root. That's the English word. Oh, you can use this root to make soap. When if you learn the Miwok word for it, the Miwok word has such a beautiful diversity that reveal the power of this plant that are lost in the English name. And I remember asking, why do all these plants have Latin names? And why are they named after a white man? You know? And then I learned like, oh, colonization. And it broke my heart because when the Miwok would share, this is what our name for the plant is, you would hear in the Miwok word all the properties of this plant. You would learn it's also for medicine. You would learn it's also for poison oak. It has multiple properties. But then when the English colonizers came, they gave it an English Latin name that stripped it of all the knowledge that the native name had. And there's so many people I've spoken to globally who said, we should create a bureau word for the loss of knowledge when a plant is given a Latin name, when an animal is given a Latin name, because when you look at the Latin names, you're stripping them of thousands of years of cultural knowledge that people who have had these animals and plants in their world for thousands of years. So I think sometimes it's also a matter of asking, what is the local word for this plant? What is the local word for this animal? And then you start realizing this wealth of relationships are revealed. And that's what always breaks my heart, because when you learn that as a small child, you're like, gosh, all the magic and all the diversity of the world has been taken away by renaming the plant. Sorry, that's
Completely.
And further, a lot of those Latin names include the name of the like white person who discovered it. You know, like,
Yeah, no, it's crazy. Yeah.
So Alessandra, if you guys wanted to create a word with us, where, because we've always wanted to create a word for the phenomenon of loss of knowledge when it gets a Latin name. But everyone feels overwhelmed to create
Yeah,
this.
it's
But if you,
big.
right, if you at Wimblu wanted to help us, because we should also create a word for naming when you create a Latin word for a plant, you lose thousands of years of
Mhm,
knowledge and relationship, because oftentimes the native word for plants, it's far more of
mhm,
a respectful, that they have more energy, they have more spirit, they have more life. But when
yeah,
you have the Latin name or the English name, it becomes an inanimate object, you
mhm,
know, that's to be used for humans
yeah.
versus power the plant has onto itself.
Mm. Yeah, well,
Yeah.
to
And
answer your
even just
question, definitely, yes, we would love to be part of that. Yeah. But I also wanted to point to what you're saying, that it's about relationships in the end, yours, as you were saying before, words exist in relationship. Like you may bring a word, but within a certain set of relationships, it might not make sense as it does in another context of relationships. But then it's also the other way around. It's like names are also emerging from a certain kind of relationship. And I love what you're bringing. I remember that I once read as well about I can't remember now like what the culture or the plant was, but it was a plant in Mexico that there was these native people who would call it the same way that they would call their aunts.
Yeah.
And so, like these anthropologists were speaking about what that opens up in the possibilities of relationship, that immediately, because there is kinship, then this word makes sense to use it across different kind of relationships. So I think that this is so important to highlight about language as emerging from and enabling relationships. That there is this reciprocity, and this is why it needs to get to be in constant reconstruction, and that reconstruction can only happen if before first we come into relationship, that we need to come first into relationship, then naming it, because then it's harder to do it the other way around, because it's what's happened with colonization in a way. They named it because they wanted to use it. They didn't take the time to come into relationship before actually naming it.
Yeah, it was used, like you said, it lost its spirit and
Mm.
it lost its mana. It became an
Mhm,
inanimate object. Once
mhm,
something goes to becoming inanimate, you don't have any guilt or any feelings about using
mhm.
it the wrong way.
Mhm.
But if everything's alive and everything is
Exactly.
respected as alive, you treat it very differently. And you also are aware that, wow, this life is giving me life, and therefore
Mhm,
I must be thoughtful and respectful of it.
Mhm.
And I think it's possible. I mean, how cultures shift is so beautiful. Like when you look at social change, it only takes 5% of a population to affect a social change. And I think social change also requires all different sectors of society saying the same thing, right? So when you see revolution or when you examine revolution, it's because like every different sector is starting to shift, but it doesn't have to be the entire 100%. It can be just 5% of that.
mhm,
So what if
mhm,
just 5% of global languages shifted to being more respect of all living beings or other
Relational.
cultures? Yeah, relational. Like, not to say that our artwork is going to save the world,
mhm.
but if every facet of culture changes, it becomes a sound you can't ignore, if that makes sense.
Mhm. It
And
does,
I
yeah.
and I think it's a lot about like creating the space for that. And the words themselves become these like spaces that move through the world. But also, we following up on what Heidi was saying about, movements, we experience so much of our world in isolation,
Mm.
and especially when we have anxiety around something. And so, I mean, this is a very, very, very um, simple example. But, when Heidi and I first came together, we had here in California had these years of droughts. And where we are in California, is historically pretty foggy and cool.
Mhm.
And we were having these unusually warm late winters when it should be a rainy season. And we were having these really, really sunny, beautiful, quote unquote, beautiful days then. And we were both having a lot of anxiety and mixed emotions around that. And a lot of like mourning in a way, um, advanced mourning, thinking about the future. And this was something we weren't really talking about because, we're already environmentalists and you don't want to be that bummer in the room, sort of like talking about things.
Mm.
But then when we connected on that, that was then we decided that would be like a word we would make initially. And then once we started talking about it, we found that so many other people were feeling that feeling. And then we've had the opportunity to take this project into other geographic locations, nationally and internationally. And we found so many people with that very simple phenomena. And oftentimes it's like this, like, oh, like they say it in this hushed voice, like they don't want to. And we're like, oh, yes, we have this half dozen words for that. But we don't say that initially. We just like let them talk about this thing. So when we can shift things, whether or not there's one agreed upon word or just enough space in cultures to get these ideas out from inside of us into like greater dialogue. It doesn't have to be, the specific word, but creating that space to recognize that, I feel like can be so important. And I feel like the Bureau does help to do that. And whether or not it's about nomenclature and we name the actual words that get into the lexicon, I think that's less important to us. We have lots of ideas and definitions that we've talked about a lot that now the culture has created their own words for, and that's great. You know what I mean? We have more language around that. So we're just helping to facilitate that.
Yeah. I think there's something so crucial about everything that we've been speaking, and it's about remembering that almost like the evolutionary role of language has been to bring us into relationship, into connection, into shared experience, right?
Yeah.
And we've turned it into these sort of boxes and dictionaries, and that as if it was a tool to organize everything and take control of everything. But no, actually, language as it is, as a living being, as something that changes, it's there for us to reach out to the other, and share and have a shared experience. So I love what you're saying, because that is also so important to bring back the word in community. We do these storytelling nights at Wimblu where we come bring the stories from our magazine into like live readings. And then we hold a circle, like a word circle. Everyone is sharing, and it's beautiful. It's not the same as having them read our stories alone in their houses, which of course we also like love the idea of that experience, but to put words in community, in conversation, in dialogue, in a live dialogue, not, this little box that you can write anything and then just detach from the actual conversation. I think this is so important, the role of language in community.
Yeah. And I think also one of the things we do at the Bureau is we've forgotten, humans will do amazing things based on feeling and emotions, right? That's how mothers will defend their children. That's how people will justify going to war. But when it comes to climate change and some of the biggest issues facing humanity, there's been this false prioritization of science and laws and politicians. And the beautiful thing about the Bureau is because we focus so much on climate change, we ask everyone to bring a feeling or experience for which they wish there was a word. And the beauty of this is that it makes everyone human again. There is no expert in the room. There is nobody who knows more. Everyone's equal in their feeling and everyone's equal in their experience. And I think we need to do that culturally is to, if we are all in this together, then we all need to be valued equally in this together. And therefore, when we have these gatherings, by asking everyone to bring a feeling or emotion, it changes the dynamic because we're starting from a really human experience and no one is not smart enough and no one is not. And I think it recalibrates what does it mean just to be in relation when we're trying to solve the problem. I don't know if I'm saying it eloquently,
Yeah.
but I think we have to also, the way that we
Yeah.
approach these challenges, the process that we approach these challenges has to change. Because if you get a science degree, one of the things you have to do is the scientific method, which basically means if you test something and it doesn't work, you have to change how you do something. And in the climate movement, we haven't changed how we address the crisis. Culture isn't elevated as essential for the climate change solution, but it is essential. If we really want, it's not a scientific problem with climate change, it's a culture problem. And until we shift the culture, climate change will never, be solved. But for some reason, that's not valued
Yeah.
as much
And in many,
as
sorry.
technology and other things. And like I just quickly want to wrap it up. There's one, we were in the Paris climate change talks in 2015, and this German student who came created the word Täuschnikreis, and it comes from the German word devil's circle. And he said, we can't use the same technology to solve the problem that was created by technology. Like this false belief that technology will save the climate crisis is false. It has to be a culture shift.
Um, totally. And following up on that, I feel like it is oftentimes the the scientists and the experts who then, when we create that platform to start with feelings and personal experiences, they don't have that opportunity within their discipline because, and I think it's very important that scientists are objective and that there's measured language, but just like you were talking about how language is meant to bring us together, it also silos us. And so scientists are keeping to these facts and figures instead of expressing their rage and horror and fear and grief about what's happening. And we've had the science for 40 years. So like what Heidi was saying about shifting the culture is so important. And I think that's what we create these openings to do.
No, I'm totally with you, and I think again I see so much resonance with our premises, so to speak, at Wimblu, in which one of the reasons why we started our project is because we were a bit exhausted by these narratives in dominant media that it was either like absolute doom or like technological salvation.
Yeah.
And or even, even when it was like well intended, like it had like this environmental concern in it, it was always a message of convincing. I have to convince you that this is a problem and that you need to act, right? And in any of these choices, in any of these options, your agency is taken away because you don't get to, like, everyone is telling you what to think, how to defend the argument, like what are you trying to be convinced of? And a lot of what we're trying to do is create stories in which people can come with their own experience, just a space where they can pay attention to their own experience and to the experience of others as well. So I often joke that it's kind of we try to make stories that are like a rehabilitation center. You're coming into this story for like a rehab of your attention, of your sensibility, of your own experience, and very corporeal and emotional experience of the world. So I love what you're putting forward because it's about this. We need to bring people back into their own experience of the world. We're all experts in being life on Earth, right? Earth created us all and gave us like all the knowledge and wisdom that we know to make a good life in this world. So
yeah. And I think what's also beautiful is because we've been doing it for 10 years, when we would have strangers, like for example, we did something on drought. So we invited 6 to 8 people who didn't know each other, but they knew us. So there was a PhD in freshwater, there was a mother, there was a poet.
Mm.
The beautiful thing is that when you start off an evening with bring a feeling or experience, also your trust, and also when people eat
Mm.
food together, like we're basic human beings. When you share a meal together, you trust
Mm.
somebody. It's just how we are. And to have these really depressing conversations over something nourishing, like to have food, to have it in a
Yeah.
living room, to have nice lighting, to
Mhm.
feel relaxed.
Mhm.
People leave the end of these salons feeling like they have a new network. And the beautiful thing is that because there's a scientist and because there's a writer and because there's a mother, you are creating a interconnectedness among really siloed and segregated sectors of
Mhm.
society. And you did it through what has worked through thousands of years, which is listening to everybody. Everyone has a voice at the table, and then you're eating food. Like like you were saying, human beings have thousands of years of knowledge in us. And I
Mhm.
think we sometimes forget how powerful some of these simple acts of humanity are.
Yeah.
We overcomplicate or we give away our power
Mhm.
to the scientist, we give away our power to the politician. All of these people are supposed to be working for us, and
Mhm.
we forget that. And I think there's beautiful small ways that without a lot of money, you can recalibrate your role in society and your voice in society.
Mm.
And
And
that,
discomfort. I'm sorry. No, go ahead,
oh, no,
Alicia,
no.
please.
Yeah.
Well, I was just going to follow up on Heidi. In addition to those salons, a lot of the times the way we operate is our mobile field offices where we're set up with a desk and we're
Mm.
there with a big banner behind us, and people come to us, and we do that in a lot of different circumstances and facilities. And especially early on when we had fewer words to choose from, folks would come up to us and they'd be like, your words are too depressing. And you need more positive words because people get too down
Mm.
about things and then they look away. And we were like, yes, absolutely. We agree with you. Make a positive word with us. Sit down. And then folks would sit down, and immediately what would start coming out from them when we started talking was like the most depressing thing you've ever heard about their fear and their
Mm.
anxiety and their grief
Mhm.
around this. And so a lot of just like, we're so grief phobic and we're so death phobic,
Mhm.
and so I think just creating that space to sit with that and to
Mhm.
recognize that is so powerful in then moving on and not having this, because we're in artwork, we're not solution based. We're not,
Mhm.
we're not putting that agenda on people. And I feel like that's one of the really powerful things about it. And then also going back to like the humor thing, because we are kind of using humor, that can be a way to talk about some of the really hard things to
Yeah.
talk
Mhm.
about, have that angle on them.
Yes.
Yeah, no, completely. No, I was gonna say two things. One is that about this food element that I think it's so powerful, because
Mhm.
that right there is a conversation, this chemistry that happens between the body of the food and our bodies, just I I particularly always find it fascinating that you can bite into something and feel pleasure. This is already like a chemical conversation going on in a way. It's our brains decoding the sweetness or like the feeling of the food. So I think that it's wonderful because then you're not only having the intellectual conversation, you're having a very sensorial, corporeal conversation at the same time as you're trying to process all these feelings. And yes, like definitely this breaking these silos, as you said, this separation of of who can speak together, who can come together to speak. We have one of the projects that we do is this podcast where we invite natural scientists, but we do these interviews from a very like intimate, personal, we want to know about their more personal motivations to do their work. And also we put their work in conversation with myths, with spirituality, with philosophy, and these conversations are wonderful because suddenly, these very, as you're saying, Alicia, like they don't get the chance to speak about this when they're doing their work. And when you open that door, what happens and what comes out of them, because this is people who has been paying attention to the world so closely, for so many years. And they have so many stories to tell, and they have so many feelings to share that find no space in this language that we like turn into the main language to solve everything, and so I think it's so important what you're saying, to sort of like create the spaces. It's not about what is being said. It's not about a solution. It's not even, about the final message, but just about the opportunity to have the conversations, to have the pause. Yeah.
Yeah, when we were in Paris, we had our mobile field study office set up for 3 weeks because we had started the project in the United States and we were wondering, does this have a global, can we do this globally or is it just a US thing? And we were testing it by being there for 3 weeks. And have you heard of the rights of nature where they will do these mock courts where they, so one of those lawyers was there in Paris doing a rights of nature, do nature have rights in the legal system? And when we set up, we're two people behind a desk, we have the banner, and then there's two chairs in front of us. So we're doing a lot of invitation for people to come and lead their conversation of curiosity. And a man came up and he said, "Can I sit here?" He didn't want to participate, he just wanted to sit down. And I said, "Of course." I said, "What do you do?" He said, "I'm a lawyer. I'm here for the rights of nature." I said, "Oh, wonderful." And then he's like, "What do you do?" And I explained the Bureau, and he looked at me like, "Okay." And I said, "Do you want to create a word?" And he's like, "No." And I said, "Okay, what inspired you to become a lawyer?" He's like, "Oh," I'm like, "But what, law school is hard and getting a science degree is hard. What inspired you to do it?" And he started to cry. Like, because I care. And then he's like, he just cried and cried and cried. He's like, "But I'm not allowed to show any emotion when I practice the law because then I'm not considered objective." And I said, "But you do this because you care. You do this because you have emotions." And he just sat there and he cried. And so I went up and I gave him a hug and then he walked away. And so I feel that when you look at and you ask scientists, why are they doing this? When you ask lawyers, why are they doing this? Even when you ask some politicians, why are they doing this? Humans are usually motivated by something around emotions, and it shouldn't be removed from our culture. It shouldn't be edited out because it makes us complete human beings. And also, my friend Faith, who I mentioned earlier, she has a PhD in freshwater. Her job is to go to communities in California after a fire has destroyed them to talk about where not to build again. And she was giving the data and she was telling them, "You shouldn't rebuild here. You will probably lose your home again." And this woman screamed in the audience, "I can't take you seriously. You're a machine. You're a robot. You have shown no emotion." And she said one of the problems now scientists are having is that many regular people don't believe them anymore because they're not angry, because they're not crying. And they're now getting the feedback, "I can't believe that this is really as bad as you say it is because you're showing no emotion." So the removal of emotion now is a problem for scientists who are trying to communicate about climate change. And now they have to find a way to reinsert emotion when it was there all along.
All along, yeah, of
Yeah.
course.
So, and that's what the Bureau does is we allow for you to come completely as you are and to create words according to how you really are experiencing things. And you don't have to edit anything out and you don't have to remove anything. Sorry, that was very long. You'll probably edit that.
No, that's beautiful. No, that's beautiful. That's
Yeah.
beautiful. And yeah, and I think it gives us like a portal again. As we close our conversation, we're at the top of the hour, but I would really like to have some space because I've loved hearing about some of the words that have come out of the Bureau and like the experiences and the stories behind them. So I was wondering if you could share a few more, some words that you are particularly fond of through this process and the stories behind them, and especially if there is any word that you think that speaks to what we were saying before, our relationship to the more than human world, or even this that you're saying, making sense of the emotional experience of our times. Yeah, I would love to hear a few more anecdotes before we go. Yeah.
Um, um, we made a word um, with a group called Serenteletonic, and that speaks to the happenstances that came together through evolution that brought us onto the world that we're sitting here in
Mm,
conversation, and that none of that had to happen, and it all happened randomly and in a way magically. And using that to think about the outsized impacts that our
mm,
choices made today and how they cast a shadow on whether or not um, the future will be more diverse or less diverse. And so it's this like thinking about our future is still plural. I think a lot of the times we want to think about like we're on this road, but we still have that possibility of options, and that we owe it to our future our future ancestors are, the ones who come in front of us, but also to our ancestors, the more than human ancestors as well that have brought us there. That's one that comes to mind.
Yeah. And to add to what Alicia said about Serenteletonic, the part about it being the future is still plural. I think a lot of us, especially if you're an organizer or you're trying to affect social change, thinks there's two ways, the worst case scenario
yeah.
and the best case scenario.
Mm,
But there's always a third option. And to be open and appreciate that there's many factors still at play, and there could still be a third way that we might not even know yet, but that we have to be open to receiving and participating in. And I'm going to share the word quiesced, which this woman, Ash Arter, who's an artist, created. And she wanted to create a word where she's African American and she now works with plants. And she said, I'm so frustrated because my ancestors know so much about plants, but they moved to Detroit to escape slavery and the plantations in the South. And then no one wanted to say they were good with plants, because if you say you're good
mm,
with plants, you might,
yeah.
be captured and sent back down to the South.
Mhm.
And now she has an innate calling to work with plants. And she said, I'm so frustrated because I want to work with plants now. So she created this word called quiesced, which means that a seed stays consciously dormant until it finds itself in a safe and fertile environment, and only then does it take seed. And so she's
Mm,
blending a social phenomenon with a biological phenomenon.
mhm,
And we're no longer segregating and siloing a biological and a
mhm.
social phenomenon, but they're one and the same.
This is so beautiful. Yeah, like what we were speaking before, these relationships that are built within like a small word, already so many possibilities of words. I also love the experience of listening to a word that you have no idea what it means, because then you kind of like have to get curious about the sounds of it, about like the components of it, that it's not just about, even before you go into the meaning, you need to sort of like taste the word first
Mm.
and then try to guess like the story. And then you can, of course, listen to the story and it makes sense. And you can even find like this very natural human satisfaction of putting meaning to a word, right? To a sound. So I think it also speaks about our experience of language a lot. Yeah. Is there anything else that you would like to add or ask or anything, before we close?
I would say, I invite people to create their own words. Like they don't need the bureau, and friends and have dinner together. And just the simple prompt of, pick a word you love and why, or pick a word you hate and why, because it's like an icebreaker. It gets people thinking. Then also share an emotion or experience for which you wish there was a word, and see if at the dinner table you can create a new word for that. And even if you don't create a word, and even if the word is horrible, the conversations are so delicious that this is something humans can do globally.
Yeah. Is there a certain method or like anything that you do to get this going, or is it just that little question at the beginning?
I think it's listening and conversation and like making people feel comfortable and digging into the conversation. And sometimes it's not that first thing that they bring, but like through dialogue, sussing it out further and thinking about these things. And it's not even just listening to their language. You know, you were talking about before about like the food and about how, you know, words silo, but so much of it is about, you know, so much of communication is not through the words. You know, we're picking up on all these cues as well. So I think just, you know, listening.
It would just be like create a safe space, you know, let people come as they are and don't judge people for their feelings or emotions or experiences. Let everyone share it. And if there's a common interest, something will come forward. But I really think it's just creating a safe space for people to come as they are and share whatever emotion or feeling they want to discuss. And it happens to be that 6 to 8 people is the ideal number because, yeah, they found that 8, you have enough diversity, and also it allows for the quietest person to talk. And then we found like dinners are very good, or because then if you have the whole night, and then people don't feel rushed or they don't have to go somewhere else, you can let conversations wander, and also enough time for the quietest person to feel like they can have space because sometimes they won't talk if it's too short. Things like that.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for your time and for everything you've shared. Like we are so inspired by your project, and it's been an honor to have you here and speak with you about language. And I'll definitely take your word on it and reach out and see if we can come up with a new word for. Is that the loss of knowledge when we lose the names of plants? Is it? Was it?
Yes. Oh, I would love that.
We would absolutely love that. Yeah. So let's set it up.
And
Yeah,
also,
I think that'd be super fun.
we accept an unlimited number of synonyms, right? So this word that we create could just be one of thousands, but it's just to get it moving. And that's the thing about the Bureau. We're not perfectionists. And it's very much create something. It's better to create something than to be silent. And if somebody doesn't like it, well, with them, we serve as an inspiration for them to create something better.
Exactly. Yeah.
And
I love it. It's about creating the space, as you've been saying.
And if that, through the conversation, if that definition, if that idea shifts, you know, and we uncover something else, like we're just very open to following that flow of things.
Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah, no, I'm looking forward to it. It will be a really great experiment. Well, again, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for being here, and thank you for your work. I think it is so important what you're doing, and to bring this humor to it. I also love that element of your project. So thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to speak to you today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Bye.
Our conversations about language and ecology are spaces to expand our perception and understanding of language, and how it shapes our relationship with ourselves and the more than human world. If you resonate with our content and see the importance of keeping it open and free, consider supporting our project by joining our Patreon community, where you will have access to exclusive content. You can also support us with a donation through PayPal, or if you are in the United States, you can also make a tax-deductible donation through our fiscal sponsor, the International Documentary Association. Wimblu is a creative documentary studio that creates and publishes non-fiction stories that restore our sense of belonging and connection to the earth. You can follow our work by subscribing to our newsletter and our YouTube channel, or by following on social media. Thanks for listening.